So I'm going to have quite a few ideas. I'll go reasonably quickly, and then if there's questions individually, then do come back to me and we can chat about those at the end, or you can contact me individually. I think there's kind of two main chunks that I want to give you. One is a group of principles. So why is something worthwhile doing? And then some really practical stuff, some tips, some how you can get on and do things that will make a difference. And put those in the context of the virtual area. Some of these will actually be good general practice anyway, but these are really connected with thinking about how they will work within the virtual area. The three principles I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute are very much that the who and how, what I call you, the brand of you is important in the way that you come across, and it's quite shocking how important that is, and therefore paying attention to it is key. Secondly, this concept about creation, not reception. We'll go into more in this, but it's the core idea that says you think you're telling people stuff, but what you're actually doing is informing them, and then they create the answer themselves, which is quite an important difference, especially when it comes to virtual presentations. And the reason for that, as you'll see, is based on electronics and physics, the actual nature of virtual communication. So there's three principles, and they're going to lead into 5 simple tips and hints. One which is about the stuff that Bill's just talked about, being prepared. The other is not having dogs that bark in your background when you're giving presentations. The third one, so the second one is why, so focusing on your audience from a why they would want to listen to you perspective. And then a little bit about pre-work, how you connect with people, perhaps prior to a presentation, a meeting or whatever, which we might have forgotten to do, something which we do more naturally in the live workplace, but it's still really important, and strange enough is really important to do not in the video form. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about emotion, pathos, and I'll explain those words in more detail, but it's about how you need to use more of this in connecting with your audience virtually than you might do when you're just connecting with them face to face. And lastly, being more inventive, perhaps mixing your media wherever you can to engage the audience even more. So I've got some practical tips there, but I want to start with these principles. And the reason I want to start with these principles is because although I could just give you the tips, my experience is that if you give somebody a tip, they might do it. If you give somebody a tip and then you give them a really interesting connection as to why that works, they're quite likely to use it in the future. And I hope that will work for you. So let's think about some of the foundations and the principles of pretty much all communication, actually. And the first one is deeply depressing, I'm afraid, especially if your job, like me, is sometimes to do communication to people. The first one is that basically your audience isn't listening to you. Most of the time, the audience is not listening. That's just normal. It's not you personally, it's just the way that we all are. We get very easily distracted with our chimpanzee brains. Secondly, even if they are listening, they're entirely making it up themselves. And thirdly, both of these are much worse when you're in the sort of virtual environment. So whilst you may be up against it anyway during a normal communication session, you are particularly up against it when it comes to virtual communications. Therefore, you have to be even more focused on how you come across. The second key principle I'd like you to consider is about stop thinking it's about being right. Now, I worked in procurement. I was a procurement director for many years, and I have to say, I think one of the challenges procurement people sometimes have is that they are both right and unheard. So they sometimes present stuff that is true, but for some reason it doesn't resonate because they think, well, surely people will get it because I'm right. And that's not enough. When you're presenting factual data, however good the factual data is, you've actually got two parts to your message. You've got the data itself, that's essentially what you are saying. So the facts, if you were. And the second part of this is the deliverer. This is who and how. Who's delivering it and how are they delivering it? Now, there is a tendency that most people have to believe on this simplistic diagram that most of it's down the data end, i.e. if I'm right and the data's good, yeah, there'll be a bit of my credibility in there, but at the end of the day, the data will speak for itself. And I don't believe that to be true. I actually believe that you're far down the other end, where actually most of what you will do, the impact that you will have, will be determined by who you are and how you deliver it, and only a small percentage by the actual data itself. So that's quite a challenging thought, but it also means that you need to think about how you're presenting, particularly online. That who and how is very much about your brand, what you're like, maybe as a department, maybe as a company, maybe as an individual. All of these will have a part to play in the effect it has on factual data. And a very quick example, do look this up on the internet later on, I'll just be brief with this, but this man probably needs, unfortunately, no introduction. But there was a very interesting thing that happened, and I'm going to speak in support of Donald Trump, actually, surprisingly, in this particular slide, between two people, Donald Trump and Carl Bildt, who was the ex-Prime Minister of Sweden. And Donald Trump gave a speech in which he appeared to say that Sweden was having problems with immigrants. And that was interpreted by Carl Bildt, and indeed by the entire world, to say that he was talking about a terror attack in Sweden. And everybody laughed, and there was lots of memes on the internet about this. However, a year later, when unfortunately, or depending on your viewpoint of politics, quite a lot of right-wing parties gained traction in the Swedish elections, Trump claimed he was right. And the interesting thing is he was. This isn't me commenting on politics. What it is saying that everybody said he had joked and made a mistake to say that a terror attack had occurred in Sweden. But it never did, and he never said it. And you can even go back and see on the internet the clip of the film where he talked about it, and he never mentions it. And yet we all thought he did. And that's because his brand was one which twisted the facts even when he didn't say them. Brand, your brand, the who and how is really important. This idea of creation, not reception, is pretty transformatory once you get it and start working with it. So the idea is whatever you're saying is essentially received like a black box. You have input, you then receive it, and then you give some output. But your brain is essentially a black box. It's receiving a bunch of stimuli, and then it's creating, based on experience, what that means. It says, okay, I think you just said that. But the process is essentially creation, not reception. Now, there's lots of fun ways of demonstrating this. Again, there's all sorts of things on the internet. This is a quick one, just about this concept of the power that we as individuals have to essentially make things up. Here you've got an image which I hope you can all see clearly on the screen, which is a kind of, looks like one of those flip phones or a folded box being opened up. And I would believe, because I've shown this to many, many audiences all around the world, that almost everybody in the audience will see that image and they will see that there is a vaguely dark grey box sitting on top of a vaguely light grey box. That's what we see. Now, the interesting thing is when you get a colour bar, and I'm going to click a colour bar and bring it across, an interesting thing happens when you start looking at it. Because when you bring this colour bar across and you place it over the middle of the image, what you actually see is that in the center of the top square, you can't see the edges of the color bar because they're the same color. But interestingly, in the bottom square, they are also the same color. Now that's a simple optical illusion. But the reason I like this particular optical illusion is that even though you now know the center of the top and the center of the bottom square are the same color, for about 95% of people, it still looks different. And that's because we're creating an image based on rules that we make up in our own head, even though we're presented with clear evidence that it's not the case. This is powerful stuff. Creation is powerful stuff. Non-face-to-face, so this sort of thing, unfortunately makes all of this creation process much worse. And it's down to some very critical, subconscious effects that the internet and video calling, etc., has on us, which is why we often feel very tired when we've done lots of video meetings and conferences. And it's based on a couple of things that cause us to be stressed. One's called no gap, the other's called no overlap. And these are normal, subconscious, conversational things that we have as humans when we communicate. No gap is that moment where when you're talking to somebody and there's an awkward silence before they answer. If there is a tiny silence before they answer, in general, we don't believe them or we think that they're foolish. That just happens. Likewise, if people speak over each other, then that can also cause stress. And you really need no better example than the recent presidential debates to show how bad that can feel if there are constant overlaps. And unfortunately, in this media where you have many people in a meeting, or even 4 or 5 people in a meeting, there's often lots of overlap speaking because we don't pick up the visual cues that show somebody's about to speak. So this causes stress during these types of meetings and presentations, and that stress means I'm listening less. So that's why this is quite important. Now we know that from phone calls that we're making where it keeps breaking up and you get very stressed when you can't hear the other person, and you know it happens a lot, but you still get stressed by it. But the interesting thing when you come down to these sorts of things, maybe when we're sat with a decent camera and all that good stuff, it still causes some subconscious effects. And that's just because of the technology. Originally, the technology that causes us to send information, invented by the American Army, is all about packaging it. You sort of kind of package up the electronic information, you send it, and then you depackage it on your own computer. That's what happens. Unfortunately, in that process, even with the best internet, there's a delay. Not much, about 150 milliseconds on packing it and about 150 milliseconds on unpacking it. That means even with the very best internet connection, you've got a delay there in the to and fro of conversation of about 300 milliseconds. Now, why is this important? Well, it's simple. Because if you have a 400 millisecond gap, which is a blink of an eye, it causes people to feel concerned. It's like, oh, did they believe what I said there? I'll just check that again. If your internet's a bit slower and it comes down to, let's say, 600-700 milliseconds, actually you think you disbelieve what they're saying. This is powerful subconscious pull on our believability. And secondly, a lovely piece of research, not related to this, but now being seen as relevant to this, is a very simple physical thing. And that's that if the image you get is poor, you will tend to disbelieve either what you're reading or what you're seeing. And there was this lovely example that was done in psychological labs for testing people that had a camel and a giraffe. And the statement that they wrote down to people was this simple statement: the giraffe can go longer without water than a camel. And it can. This is a true statement. But what they did was they presented to people that same statement, but then to another group they presented the same statement, but a little bit fainter. And then another group a little bit fainter still, and another group a little bit fainter still. And there's a direct linear correlation between how faintly something is written and how much people believe it. So clarity is literally that. If you can see something clearly, you will believe it more. And so we tend to, however good your camera, however good your lights, we tend to believe what we're seeing on screen less, simply through the physics of it. So these are quite powerful forces that come into play. So what can we do? You've got a problem. Your audience isn't really listening. They don't really trust what they're hearing, and they're making it up anyway. That's quite a challenge. So what the hell can we do? Well, I think there's 5 things that you can do. Quite practical things, quite simple things that can help you to have more impact with whatever message you're getting across. The first one, and I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail so that it gives you a little bit more meat on the bone, but all the good stuff that Bill was just talking about in terms of preparation. Secondly, this idea about focusing on why, not what. which is how to engage with the audience's needs, thinking about warming up people by phone wherever you can. I'll talk about this pathos, this emotion within the discussion, and a bit less logos, a bit less facts. Take out some of your presentation and give less over the screen. And where you can, mix your comms, mix your media. Even in this virtual age, it is still possible if you want to maximize your effect. So let's look at this first one, all the good stuff that Bill has just said. The way I want to summarize this is this idea about the fact that you're on show, and as long as you have thought through everything and it's deliberate, I think that's the best you can do. Now, maybe that does mean that you want to have a bookcase behind you with the book that you've written carefully placed all over it. I don't mind, as long as that is a deliberate act. Or if you want to wear headphones because you find them easier for you to hear, that's fine too. As long as it's a choice, as long as you haven't just come on the screen and it's just whatever I was, wherever I was, without any thought behind it. So you're on show, so do something to do the best you can in your circumstances to be able to dress what you're doing. So it's about making it a deliberate choice. The next one is what I call stop starting with what, which is where most people do start. It's like, what have I got to say? What do I want to say? And I start there, and then that drives my content. And that is a problem because most people start here. What have I got to say? Instead of starting there, start here. Why? Why would the audience want to listen to what I've got to say? Why would they possibly have some sort of leverage about what I'm engaging them with? And that's the key question, because the why should drive the what. Even if that means, well, I'm going to have to chuck out half of my, well, particularly if it means I've got to chuck out half of my presentation, that's fine. Remember, they wouldn't have listened to it anyway. So start with the why. Why would they be interested? But that should totally shape the what you're saying. The what you're saying should then shape the how, which will be linked to the things that I'm talking about. How am I going to get this across? And then the questions, what if? But it all goes right back to the start of this with why would the audience be interested? And the honest answer is, if you can't answer that question in the positive, then don't even give the presentation, because it ain't going to happen. They're not going to be listening. Warming them up. Those of you who might have seen me talk on networking, I'm really keen on this 4-stage process. This know, like, trust, buy. This idea that if you want people to buy your idea, then they've really got to trust you in some way, at some level. And if they're going to trust you, they will only do that if they, at some level, like you, because they know you. And these are two very important things, this knowing and this liking, this warming up, in order to get people to buy what you're going to say. So I'd focus on that area as much as you can. Now, we've lost some of the ability to do this. You know perfectly well, I'm sure you're good at networking, you're good at influencing strategic management of people. When you're in the office, it's easy to pop by somebody's office and just go, oh, Tuesday's meeting, by the way, I was just going to raise that issue on so-and-so, and I think that would be a good idea, etc. We're quite good at doing that because we have the opportunity. When we're distanced, we don't. And that's where I'd say you've got to take more proactive choice to get in touch with some of the key people beforehand. And strange enough, I believe you should get in touch with them not through video, because I still firmly believe that actually there is a stronger connection that you make with people just using the phone than by using video, particularly where you are not emotionally attached. Now, this might be different if you're looking at your grandchildren, or it might be different if you're looking at your partner, because you're already emotionally attached. But I'm assuming that most of you aren't quite as in love with your work colleagues as your grandchildren or your partner, and therefore actually they need a bit more warming up. And it's better doing that by telephone, where the connectivity is faster and you don't have some of these distractions of the visual, than you are by doing it on video. So warm them up more where you can. And then these concepts about pathos. Now, this is not a new idea. These are actually phrases which come from Aristotle. And they're still true today in a rather wonderful way. And there's three concepts which I'll explain briefly: ethos, pathos, and logos. Obviously Greek words, although as we know these are very prevalent in certainly in English and in French as well. So logos, logic. Pathos is where we get pathétique or empathy, sympathy from, and our ethos is all about our credibility. So ethos is about credibility. How can our brand help us to seem credible on screen? And that's, I think, done through pre-calls. So making sure that you've done everything you can to build your brand prior to presenting where you need to, because it kind of sets the scene. Pathos is the emotion, empathy, sympathy. These are the emotional connection that you have with your audience. It's a lot about telling stories. Now, I know we don't always have the time, and I know sometimes you think, well, what I've got to tell, or it doesn't really work well with the story. And I'm not saying you have to have great long stories. What I am saying, though, is that whenever you are presenting stuff, the more you can get visuals involved, interesting pictures, maybe some relevant fun, or things that make people just think or intrigue them, the better chance you have of engaging them with the core content, with the logos, the logic of what you're saying. And the key rule about the logic of what you're saying is go back to the why. Why would the audience want to hear what I've got to say? And then chuck out basically 50% of what you thought you were going to say, because they're not going to listen to it all anyway. So the less that you give them, the more they are likely to engage with that particular piece of data. And then you're using your ethos, your credibility, to try and really get fast into their minds. And you're using your pathos, your emotional engagement, to hook them into the message that you're giving. So simple three things that you can really work on and transform the way that you communicate. And lastly, where you can, mix your media. Because we're now on video, we tend to quite quickly get caught up in presenting sometimes over messy graphs or data that is easy to show on screen, and therefore we think people are engaging with it. Now, in fact, screens, whether you're actually presenting on a normal monitor screen or even on a big screen in a presentation hall, screens are not very good places to present decent amounts of data. They're quite hard to read because they are quite big. And I would urge you, if you've got important data that you need people to really engage with, to send them almost hard copies first, or get them to print out hard copies first, because they're much more likely to engage with that, and then use your screen, use your visuals to pick out the key bits that you need them to focus on more. So you're allowing them to consume the core data in the method that's easiest for them, and then engage them through highlighting it. And if there is any way that you can use things, now things can be images, things can be actual things, physical things that you can show on the screen, or things can be, as happened to me with a couple of the seminars I've been running, as simple as running a seminar, and it was for a group of people in London, senior executives, women executives in the financial sector. And the organizer sent out biscuits. They sent them out in little biscuits in an envelope, and they said, do enjoy this biscuit during the seminar, and it had the logo of the seminar on it. Quite a simple thing, took some time to organize, of course, but quite a simple thing that actually made a huge difference to the degree with which we were engaged when we came into that room. When we came onto that screen, we were ready and willing and wanting to hear what people had got to say, rather than being resigned to another Zoom meeting. So in summary, the key principles and the theory, remember, it's about the who and the how. You know, you want to make sure you're getting your credibility right, or at least trying to overcome the difficulties, if you've got difficulties with the credibility, ahead of the time. Creation, not reception. We're all making it up. That's okay, it's a natural process, but it does mess with the way that we work, particularly when you think about the electronics and physics of it, that mean we are already on the back foot. So what can you do? Be deliberate, prepare everything you can, practice all the good stuff that Bill was saying, make sure that you've done that as to the greatest extent that you can. Focus on why. Why would the audience be interested? And then from that, drive the what. Pre-calls, maybe not many, just one or two, but at least you've put the effort in, you've engaged them, you've talked to them, you've started to warm up the key players before you get to the key points that you're presenting. Where you can, maximize your engagement content. Use documents, use things, maybe to give the harder data, and use your pathos then to reflect on the more emotional parts, which will engage your audience into the data for them to see it and them to understand it. And all of those are very possible to do, even through the electronic media. They just require a bit more time, a bit more focus, and a bit more oomph. And if you can give it that, then absolutely guarantee that you'll improve your impact and people will be enjoying what they're seeing rather than enduring what they're seeing. So with that, I will love you and leave you and pass you back to Bill and any questions that you might have. Thank you.